Psychoanalysis, the big if. Namaste. Ideas emerge and survive in a structure. If this framework itself undergoes a change, it annihilates old ideas and brings in the erstwhile unthinkable into the center. Contextualizing the evolution of these thought frameworks to psychoanalysis, we discuss today with psychoanalysis consultant Dr. Himanshu Vaidya. Namaste, sir.
Namaste.
So when we talk about framework, structure, or paradigm, what exactly it is? What do we mean by that?
History of ideas proceeds in a unique way. Initially, a few disparate ideas, almost disjointed, emerge in different areas of human experience. So let us say somebody discovers something on magnetism. Somebody discovers something on electricity. After another 20 years, somebody discovers something on heat. After some years, somebody discovers something related to matter. Now, when you put all of this together, you create a model which is a model which tries to explain matter and energy. Now, this creates a paradigm, a framework. And this then becomes the gold standard. So what happens is it's almost like if you imagine a wooden frame, right? The wooden sticks which are used to make up the frame, they become the foundational axioms, the gold standard facts of science as science is at a particular point in time. Take for example, a few examples of this type. Today, the scientific paradigm in vogue is of Einstein's paradigm of relativity. Now, one of the wooden sticks of that frame is that nothing can move faster than the speed of light. And therefore, when you find the quantum phenomena of entanglement, where two particles are entangled and they are far from each other, and if any change happens to one, it is reflected in the way the second changes itself. And this communication is happening faster than light. Now, this is in a direct conflict with Einstein's paradigm. So this fact, which is being discovered by quantum mechanics, now within that framework cannot be explained. So there is a collision now between this scientific discovery and the framework which is existing. So either this discovery has to be given up by new observations, or it has to be explained within that thing, or we have to create a new framework. So this is how the framework of any particular time is. Now, this is very important to know because often the framework does two things, three things actually. One, it provides a stable anchor to science of a given time. Because the sticks which make up the framework are like gold standards, they cannot go wrong. And therefore, they provide a kind of anchor, a gold standard to science of a particular time. But they do two other things also. One, unknowingly, our thinking is influenced by the framework and it operates only within the framework. It's very difficult to think outside of the framework, having been influenced by the framework. And as we go along, we'll discuss how in case of psychoanalysis, this comes true. But for the moment, we just make a general statement that once you are trained in a framework, it's very difficult to think outside the framework or collide with the framework. Generally, unknowingly, you conform to the framework in which you have been trained, and your thinking also goes on a particular line. And therefore, framework also limits the freedom of one's thought and unconsciously creates a kind of conformity at the very genesis of thought. And the third is, if you go against the framework, you are going against the establishment. Because the framework did not drop from heaven. It was constructed bit by hard work of few people who are the creators of that frame, and they then become the leading authorities of that area, who have actually contributed to the creation of the frame. And it's very difficult for them to give up their lifetime's work and belief. And they have also seen that what they have discovered is actually working in reality. It was not a lie. They actually saw it working for many years. And then when you bring up the limitations, it's very difficult for them to accept. And therefore, a famous physicist made a very interesting remark. He said, science progresses funeral by funeral. That unless these old people who have created the framework, they pass away, they don't allow new frameworks to come in. And therefore, the real progress of science happens funeral by funeral. So it is as much a political and power-oriented process as much it is a discovery of truth process. So this is the broad idea of the framework. This framework, when you talk in the context of today's lexicon, especially in management, we call it paradigm. So Kuhn made this word very popular, paradigm. That there is a paradigm in which we think, a framework in which we think. And if two paradigms collide, one of them has to give way, or the both have to come together to create a combined paradigm. But Kuhn has done a lot of work in the area of paradigms. How paradigms emerge, how these frameworks emerge, what happens when they outlive their existence, their utility, and how a framework which is enabling and powering science suddenly becomes an obstacle to science. So Kuhn has done a lot of work in the area of paradigm, and this also has been taken up by philosophers. So there is a school of philosophy called structuralism. And this school of philosophy talks about the frameworks which are unconsciously operating in our mind and in society, and how it influences our thinking and policy making in society. So this is one part of it. Now, there are two parts of this thing, structuralism. One, structures which almost pervade our thinking and in some case even enable our thinking, they are not static. So they are historical in nature. So one view of structuralism is that ultimately we'll find the best structure which will give us the theory of everything. And therefore, structuralism does not see the changing nature of frameworks as something which belittles the approach of a framework. Whereas the post-structural school sees this in a different way. They say that this change in the structures tells us that it's a historical process. That there's nothing called an absolute truth. Truth is a historical phenomena. At a given point in time, it appears as the truth, but after some time, as the structures change and the contents within the structure change, the erstwhile truth no longer appears as rock solid as it once appeared. And in this historical way of thinking about frameworks and structures, we have many popular names. One is Heidegger. So Heidegger talks about the way our minds get built and the way they operate and the way we exist. And this existence is completely colored by the historical time in which we find ourselves. And this is not difficult to explain because nature has created our species where a large part of our mind does not carry information. It carries only some primary structures. and we get information and experiences from outside, so that we remain more contemporary to the changing age. And this also, in a way, gels with what Heidegger said, that our being is very relative to the time in which we live. And Gadamer talks about the same thing, that our being, our life, our thinking is also influenced by some part of history, not all of history, but something called effective history. He used the word effective history. So therefore, in their view, this framework is a framework in continuous motion and perpetual change. It is a ceaselessly changing framework where one framework gives way to the other. And it is a ceaseless historical process, and therefore there is nothing like an eternal absolute truth, which is quite contradistinction to the structural school and also to very good philosophers like Immanuel Kant, who do talk about possibility of eternal truths, possibility of eternal structural frameworks. So this is one way of looking at it. This also talks about the objectivity and subjectivity of knowledge. Because if you push the dynamic framework, dynamic structures, or the argument of postmodern school, you will be left with no truth, because everything will become subjective and relative. And pushed to the extreme, it leads to a relative nihilism, and the outcome of which is the destructive wokism and a complete chaos and anarchy. So this is one way of looking at it. Now, my opinion on this is that structuralism, if you talk about material structuralism, without any free will, without any spiritual beings, without any spiritual forces and reality, that cannot explain the whole of existence. But because it cannot explain, does not mean you abandon structuralism altogether and move towards a completely useless post-structuralism. Rather, from structuralism, instead of going to post-structuralism, you have to move to a more open and integrative and holistic structuralism. So this should have been the way forward, which I think ultimately will be the way forward. Now, this is in terms of a general philosophical elaboration. Let me take a few examples to make it easy and concrete. This entire discourse of frameworks and how the big if comes in. Let us say somebody was born in Newton's time, right? Or before Newton, or let's say at Newton's time. And he says there is some entity which does not have weight and does not occupy space. I mean, he would be considered almost a psychotic, because then the idea was that all that exists is matter. Except matter, what there is force. But the idea that something can exist without occupying space and weight and can be used commercially, right? It would be, somebody saying this would be psychotic. But today we see not only that energy does not occupy space or does not have weight, it is traded, manufactured, and there is a big sector of economy called the energy economy. So what was psychotic a few centuries back is everyday sanity today. Take, for example, the idea of Galileo, right? That Earth is the center. Sun is the center, not the Earth. So it's a complete change of framework. Till Galileo came, the framework was Earth is the center. And if you take this framework, only certain ideas will emerge. But if you take Sun as the center, new ideas will emerge. So once you change the framework, a complete set of ideas become possible. to think, to entertain, to even empirically investigate. Because if you believe Earth is the center, certain experiments you will never do, which you will do only if you believe Sun is at the center. So
True.
the framework influences even the experiments we conduct. Take the example of Newton and Einstein. Till Newton, nobody could believe that there could be a relativistic framework of looking at the universe. With Einstein, the complete framework has changed. So there is a Newtonian framework, there is an Einstein's framework, and then we had the quantum mechanics framework. And all the three, in a way, are not organically emerging one from the other. And therefore, what we know for clear is that we are awaiting a framework which will explain all the three and will lead us closer to the theory of everything. So we are awaiting that kind of framework. Now, take another example in medicine. We have taken one example, two examples from physics. Take an example from medicine. Sickness happens 2000 years back in some place, and they say it is because of a spirit. So if you think in those terms that sickness occurs because of spirits, you will keep trying to heal only in those terms. But if you think that bacteria is the cause of a sickness, you will start searching for a cure to bacteria. So the utility and the outcome of your efforts will be dictated by the framework in which you believe. If you believe in the spirits, you will never think of bacteria, you will never think of an antibiotic, and people will keep dying. So the outcome of your activity also is determined. So your activity and the outcome both are determined to a great extent by the framework in which your mind is situated. Take, for example, Big Bang. The moment you accept Big Bang as the origin of the universe, automatically you fall in the trap of materialism. Because you are not ready to question why did the Big Bang occur? Who directed the Big Bang? Now, once you get into the new observations, which just we have got from the telescope, right, which tell you that there are stars and galaxies which appear much older than the Big Bang itself. Then the whole picture of the universe changes. We are now coming to possibilities of maybe there are infinite Big Bangs just happening one after the other. And maybe our universe is one among many, situated probably in larger universes. We don't know. But the idea is the questions which will now come up and the investigations which we will now do, we would not have done if the framework was that of Big Bang. So this business of framework is very, very important to everyone. The moment the framework or any pillar of the framework changes, the big if comes in. So there are small ifs and there are big ifs. Small ifs are you apply if to anything within the framework. Like, for example, within the materialistic framework of the Big Bang, right? If you ask a question, can a black hole be used to generate energy? Let us say, now this is within this Big Bang thing.
Structuralism.
Yeah, the structural component is, you're right. That is the Big Bang structuralism. So you can ask a question of this sort. Now these are small ifs. Will universe expand forever or slow down? These are again small ifs. But the big if is, what if the Big Bang never occurred? Or what if this Big Bang, what we call the Big Bang, was one small bang in the history of the universe, and these bangs keep happening every few billion years. Now the complete picture changes that will collapse the whole framework of the Big Bang. So these are the big ifs, that when you apply if to smaller things, like in psychoanalysis, if you were to say that is the unconscious divided into various compartments, that in one compartment there are dream manufactured, another compartment there are pre-linguistic memories, third compartment there are archetypal memories. Is the unconscious structured like this? That would be a small if. But if you say, what if the unconscious is coming from past incarnations? Now that's a very big if. Or what if the unconscious is shared by the species to some extent? Now that's a very big if. So these are big ifs. Now, when you are operating within a framework, if you put if to something inside the framework, it's a small if. But if you start questioning the framework itself or any component that makes the framework, those are big ifs. And once you bring in the big if, the earth under your feet goes away. It's completely unsettling and fundamentally disorienting to think about the big ifs, and therefore all frameworks resist thinking of the big ifs. But in the historical time that we are living, certain events are happening, certain discoveries are being made, where psychoanalysis has no choice but to consider engaging with the big ifs. And therefore, this discussion is very important, that till now in psychoanalysis, we have been dealing only with the small ifs. But because of the discoveries and different things from different areas coming together, it is creating a time where big if upon psychoanalysis is coming up, and it's unavoidable. And this big if, these big ifs related to psychoanalysis have to be engaged with, because in all probability, they are going to come true in times to come.
So when we're talking about structuralism, there's a timeline to the every truth revealed or any new discovery being made. This has been the history of the mankind, right? So when we see the segregation of all these structures, as very rightly said by you, that there is no networking of intra-networking of these individual structures, which is a big lag. Now, if we come to the system or the framework of psychoanalysis, where would what is the paradigm in which psychoanalysis is situated, and why, if we apply the big if,
Right.
would be a big challenge, because it is the new most modern discovery, the unconscious.
Correct.
In the Western world.
Yeah. So this brings us to the whole idea of why do we discuss big if in the context of psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis is a product of modernity. So if we look at the framework of modernity, which has been the ruling framework for the last almost 250 years, or perhaps even 350 years.
Exactly.
Psychoanalysis emerged inside this framework. Just as modern physics, modern biology, they have also emerged inside this framework, and even modern psychology has emerged inside this framework. And therefore, none of them is free from the colors and the shadows of the framework. So let us look at what are the constituents of the framework of modernity and how they have in a majestic way and in a silent and insidious way influenced and pervaded psychoanalysis. So what are the constituents of modernity? You can take 5 constituents. Modernity as a framework is based upon 5 pillars. The first is materialism, that there is nothing like the soul or God. It's only matter, energy, and force. And life is just uh,
Consequence
a
interactions.
happenstance, yeah, a happenstance, right? A accidental consequence of 1 in a billion probability coming true. So the first pillar of modernism is materialism. Second is individualism, that the individual is more important than the collectivity, and he has to be saved from the tyranny of the collectivity. So family, society, state, world community, these are all oppressors to the individual. So individualism. Third is hedonism, that the pursuit of pleasure is all there is. Maximize pleasure, minimize pain. That's all there is to life. Fourth is empiricism, that the only way to get knowledge is by laboratory experimentation. Right? And therefore, the types of knowledge possible and the ways of acquiring knowledge, they are limited to what is called the scientific method, which is in complete conflict with Hindu spirituality, where many other ways of acquiring knowledge and very types of knowledge are listed out. But it is within modernity empiricism. So materialism, individualism, hedonism, empiricism, and last, isolationism, where you don't see man as connected or being a part of nature. We are isolated, disjointed. There is a clear gulf and break between us and nature. There is a subject-object break. And these 5 are the pillars on which modernity stands, and psychoanalysis has emerged within this framework. So psychoanalysis uses all these constructs. By and large, most psychoanalytic schools believe in materialism as a philosophy. They believe in individualism. They believe in hedonism. They believe in isolationism. And because empiricism is not possible in the laboratory sense of the word, a modified method of that is applied in psychoanalysis. But the ultimate desire still remains what Freud called the project, to find the neurological base of psychoanalysis. So psychoanalysis is something which has come up within the framework of modernity, and therefore all the characteristics of modernity are there in psychoanalysis. Now let's see how it influences practice and theory. Let us say somebody, how do you look at somebody going into ecstatic states of spirituality? So we have many saints and yogis in India who go into ecstatic states of spirituality. Now, psychoanalysis would not be ready to accept anything that is a rare state, a spiritual state, the state of enlightenment, as even possible, leave alone somebody attaining it. So what happens is, once you say isolated, a man cannot experience oneness with existence. And what is called oneness of existence as an enlightenment state, if somebody experiences, psychoanalysis will say it's a regression to primary narcissism, the oceanic state.
Oceanic state.
Because its framework does not allow it to accept that there can be an oceanic state completely on demand at will, the ego wanting to go for it and the ego coming out of it. And that actually is a goal state of many spiritual development systems. Same thing with isolationism, same thing with hedonism, that ultimately it's all a pleasure game. And therefore we miss the strength and the positivity and happiness and the good health which can come from the superego. Because superego provides us with happiness, health, strength, and power, even as we give up our happiness. There is a different kind of a superego ecstasy which comes in, a superego happiness which comes in, even as we voluntarily reduce our pleasure. And that cannot be just washed away as masochism.
True.
It's a different category of a phenomenon. So, these are some of the ways in which, because psychoanalysis comes out of the framework of modernity in thinking and in practice. Say, for example, how difficult it is for any Jungian to defend himself when he talks about the collective unconscious. Because he's talking about an individual related to the species at a very operational level. An individual connected to nature or to mythology. Or somebody talking about God. Psychoanalysis becomes extremely uncomfortable. We go back to the Freudian conceptualization of regression to infantile state, looking for omnipotent parents. So these are some of the, take individualism. If somebody comes with a marital problem in psychoanalysis, the tendency would be to liberate the individual and almost be on the side of divorce, which is quite contrary to what the Eastern systems would do. They would look at it as the last resort. So the ease with which psychoanalysis would get into individualism comes from the genesis from modernity. So all the characteristics of modernity are there in psychoanalysis, and this gives its unique characteristics. At the same time, it also becomes a limiting factor. So this is where the big if comes, that as we are going towards the closure of modernity, the framework itself is collapsing. And the framework of modernity will be replaced by a new framework. And my guess is by 2032, we should have a completely new framework. And we have discussed this. Yeah, we have discussed this in one of our discussions titled Closure of Modernity. That how this framework of modernity, which has existed for the last 250, 350 years, is now drawing to a close. And what are the effects of it in various areas of human existence, both individual and social, and also political. So as the framework in which psychoanalysis was born and developed, that framework itself is coming to a close and it's going to be replaced by a new framework. Psychoanalysis faces a big if, because the framework in which it came into existence and developed itself, that framework is now facing a big if. Okay, what if the framework of modernity, which is based upon this five, what if materialism is not true? What if individualism is not completely true, only partially true? What if hedonism is only partially true? What if empiricism is only partial truth? What if isolationism is not true and actually we are living in a connected world and organic unity exists, which we have not yet seen and experienced or understood? So when all the founding pillars of modernity are being challenged today and almost successfully challenged because of work happening in different areas and also experience of people, that modernity has shortchanged us and not fulfilled all the promises it promised to fulfill once. That we find our lives very lonely, very empty, so full of pathology at the end of 250 years of modernity. And we are nowhere close to the promised land that modernity promised it will bring to us or it will take us to. So when modernity is drawing to a close, naturally a big if on modernity has come, it is drawing to a close. And this big if therefore comes also upon psychoanalysis. And it is therefore that the discussion of big if in the context of psychoanalysis becomes so important, because we have no choice but to deal with the big if in the next 7 years.
That sounds, in fact, very motivating to look forward to the new structures. As being an Indian and coming from the Eastern world, we all understand how modernity has taken over the Eastern ancient concepts of the structures which were pre-existing and are still applicable.
Correct. Correct.
So there is no ultimate truth, but yes, the truth can have different perspective, and especially in the modern world, it can be dominated with the political agendas.
True.
So when, sir, you were talking about psychoanalysis paradigm itself, is there a challenge to the framework? If we just see it from the Western perspective, because definitely in an Indian context, in the Indian spiritual context, we have a different structure which is much ahead of it.
Right.
So how do you see that? Where is the challenge? Is it that the Western world itself is going to challenge the psychoanalysis paradigm? How it is going to be?
The Zoom session is ending. Let me take it up in the next part.